Recording. Okay, welcome to the Jewish Christian Podcast. I'm Joshua Johnson. I have my co-host Tommy Kellogg with me.
Up?
And we're excited to have Dr. Ari Mermelstein with us. He's a associate professor of Bible and Second Temple Jewish literature at Yeshiva University. He's also the department chair of Bible, Hebrew, and Near Eastern Studies. So welcome, Dr. Mermelstein. We've had you in classes, but we're glad to have you on the podcast here.
Josh and Tommy, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you guys. You were my students in class last semester at Yeshiva University, so it's really a pleasure to have an opportunity to reconnect like this.
Yeah. Likewise, we appreciate you being here.
So I guess starting off, we're kind of curious to hear about your background, what it was like growing up and how you chose an academic career.
Sure. So I grew up in a house where books played an important role in our lives, both secular and Jewish. My father has a massive library. He seemed always to be in the middle of 5 different books at one time. Our meals were full of interesting questions and conversations that emerged from reading. Pursuit of knowledge was always an important part of growing up in my house. I also was steeped in Jewish learning from a very young age. From the time that I was, pretty much 6 or 7, I was studying Jewish texts in school all the way through 12th grade. And so sort of going into a field devoted to Jewish learning seemed like a natural fit. And after I graduated from high school, I spent 2 years studying in a yeshiva in Israel. That sort of only deepened my love for Jewish texts. And then I went to Yeshiva University as an undergrad. And again, more learning and sort of like, the itch to become a teacher and to become really immersed in this material on a regular, permanent basis really was something that just developed over time. As far as kind of how I got into academia, so my experience in that yeshiva in Israel was really formative. The head of the yeshiva was somebody who really emphasized the importance of collaboration, of community, of not sort of living your life siloed from the outside world. And so the idea of going into education was kind of an easy decision for me, at least at that point. I think what changed for me, the reason that maybe I didn't go into Jewish education at the elementary or high school level was that when I was in Yeshiva University, I was introduced for the first time to the academic method of studying Jewish texts, especially Hebrew Bible, but Jewish texts more generally. And that approach really resonated with me on a different and maybe more compelling way that other methods had. And it was also a window into texts that I had never encountered before. Like I said, I had studied Hebrew Bible, I had studied post-biblical Jewish texts, but there was this intermediate set of texts, especially from the Second Temple period, that I had never been introduced before, that were not part of sort of the typical Jewish day school yeshiva education. And, that really, I found it, I found the possibility of bridging 2 different corpora, Hebrew Bible and later rabbinic literature, by focusing especially, but not exclusively, on Second Temple Judaism. That was really something that, that appealed to me. And, along with that, writing is always going to be an important component of any academic class. I'd always enjoyed writing. And so there too, the possibility of working professionally in a job that required a lot of writing was something that I felt like tapped into a lot of my talents. So that was kind of where that came from.
Very cool. I think also I guess one thing I don't want to assume this, but did you grow up in New York?
I did.
I don't know if you mentioned. Okay.
I did.
New York City specifically, or just like
What's that?
upstate New York City specifically?
No, in Westchester. I actually went to Yeshiva University High School. So if you were to look at my bio, I began high school in 1990. So I was in Yeshiva University High School from 1990 to 1994. I went to this yeshiva in Israel for the subsequent 2 years. I went to Yeshiva University as an undergrad after that. And even though I went to and graduated from law school from 2000 to 2003, at the same time, I was also finishing up a master's in Revel in Hebrew Bible. And then after that began in my PhD program. So if you were to sort of like look at my bio, there was really only a 4-year period, pretty much from 2003 to 2007, when I was exclusively at NYU for my PhD, where I was not in some way directly associated with YU. So, YU is really, like it's part of my identity. I've been there really in some capacity or another for the last 35 years or so.
That's amazing. All YU all the way up.
Exactly.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So when you got your JD from NYU, were you interested in pursuing a law career? And I guess how did that shift? I guess your background could have prepared you for both equally, but I'm just kind of curious what was your thinking and how did that shift?
Yeah, I think I was at the same time that I was drawn toward education, specifically toward academia. It really is a leap of faith to go into academia, because it's not just it's not a matter of talent. It really is. It's equally a matter of being in the right place at the right time. There's a lot of good fortune that is required to land a stable job, and and the possibility of being one of these people who sort of like, teaches a course here, teaches a course there, sort of jumps from position to position, just wasn't something that I was prepared to do. And so I thought that maybe going into law would, like you said, Josh, I think it capitalized on some of my interests. I think when I enrolled in law school and imagined becoming a lawyer, I imagined that I would become a litigator rather than a corporate lawyer, because I think that litigation would have played to my strengths. Again, writing, use of critical faculty. So that was sort of my thinking. But even in law school, I kind of couldn't escape the itch to go into academia. And so, I remember my first week in law school, I went to meet with one of the professors of Hebrew Bible in NYU. NYU has a in the Graduate School of Arts and Science, they have a Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. So I went to meet with the really only because I felt very disconnected. I felt kind of rudderless for the first time. And so even though this wasn't somebody that I knew, I felt like he was connected with something that felt familiar. When I was in law school, I took courses in that department. I took more courses in Hebrew Bible, Talmud. There were courses that were offered in NYU Law School on Talmud and Jewish law that I took. I even got law school credit for taking Akkadian, which is the ancient language in which Code of Hammurabi and other important texts are written. I made even though it wasn't being offered in the law school, but I made the argument to the law school administration that, look, I'm a law student. If I want to read ancient law codes in the original, like the Code of Hammurabi, I actually have to be able to study Akkadian. So I got law school credit for taking a year of Akkadian, also in the Graduate School of Arts and Science at NYU. So that, I graduated from law school, was offered a job at a big New York firm that I deferred for a year, thinking that, at least I'll start coursework toward a PhD, and, maybe I'll have to put it aside. Maybe I'll do the PhD over time, something like that. And once I started in graduate school in that 1 year that was supposed to be sort of like, a gap year between law school and work in a law firm, I just couldn't, I couldn't tear myself away. So, yeah. So even so, at that point, I decided that I was just going to go for it. I hoped that something would work out in academia, again, with no guarantees. At that point, I have 3 kids. At that point, I didn't have any kids. I was married, but didn't have any kids. And so the finances of being a graduate student weren't yet that pressing. I was able to make it on graduate student stipend, and just really good fortune is really how things worked out. But I took a leap of faith because, sometimes you feel really drawn to something, you feel calling. And that really was the way that I felt about going into academia, kind of why I left law school. And along the way, I started in graduate school in Hebrew Bible. I did, like I said before, I did a master's in Hebrew Bible at Revel while I was in law school. But in graduate school at NYU, I was introduced really for the first time to the study of ancient Judaism. My doctoral advisor, Professor Larry Schiffman, was the chair of the department at that point. And like I said before, ancient Judaism was just a very interesting field for me because it really was a field that bridged the gap between two sets of texts that I had grown up with and that I continued to love. I teach my undergraduate teaching at YU is only on Hebrew Bible. So I teach on both the men's and women's campuses, pretty much Hebrew Bible exclusively. What ancient Judaism allows me to do is really to bridge the chronological and religious gap between Hebrew Bible and what will become later Rabbinic Judaism. And so for that reason, it was sort of just like a natural landing point for me in the field of ancient Judaism. So that was sort of how things evolved for me.
Well, we're glad you chose the teaching route. We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
Maybe for our listeners, maybe you could clarify the difference between Hebrew Bible and ancient Jewish history. Like maybe people might think those are the same, or.
Sure. So, so when academics talk about Hebrew Bible versus ancient Judaism, so Hebrew Bible pretty much runs, again, the lines are somewhat blurred, but let's consider it. And the reason that they're blurred is because as you get later into the Hebrew Bible, you already begin to bleed into ancient Judaism. Let's call ancient Judaism, like at some point during the Second Temple period. And so, ancient Judaism really is when you begin to see what looks like, different set of religious practices, different set of religious commitments, the world of prophecy, the world of monarchy, the world that you see when you're reading the classic works of the Hebrew Bible look very distant from what we find in the literature of Judaism during the Second Temple period, which is sometimes called the intertestamental period. And so what you begin to see a Judaism, for example, in which devotion to the Torah and to Jewish law has taken the place of devotion to prophecy, in which the teacher now is ascendant, and the teacher's transmission of Torah has now taken the place of the prophet's transmission of the divine message. And as part of that, you begin to see the idea of devotion to sacrifice and devotion to the temple continues to be important as the Second Temple is built, and some Jews come back to Israel from the exile and the aftermath of the destruction of the First Temple. But alongside a devotion to the temple, you really have devotion to a wider set of practices and beliefs, particularly as the Jewish world becomes, Jews basically are now situated everywhere from Western Europe all the way through Mesopotamia, which is very different than what you have during the time of the First Temple. Basically, the First Temple is destroyed in 586 BCE. And so, the lines, when I say the lines are blurred somewhat between Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism, in part that's because some of the works of the Hebrew Bible. So like, for example, Book of Daniel. Book of Daniel is, kind of firmly entrenched within the world of ancient Judaism. It's a work in the Hebrew Bible, but, that's a work that gets dealt with by both scholars of Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism. But that's kind of, the ancient Judaism is sort of the backdrop to the emergence of early Christianity, to the extent that early Christianity is emerging from this world that is now, characterized by devotion to Torah, devotion to the one God, devotion to the one temple, which is very different from the world of the Hebrew Bible, when you still had the Israelites engaged in polytheistic practice, in which the idea of one temple had not really seeped into the popular consciousness, in which the idea of Torah was still secondary to the message that was being transmitted by prophets. So it's a different set of practices, different set of beliefs, and a different set of religious commitments.
Fascinating. So I guess that kind of leads into Christianity, and I guess, well, I'm curious both how you got interested in studying Christianity, but also maybe laying the groundwork of how early Christianity relates to ancient Judaism.
Sure. So I think that my interest in early Christianity kind of grew out of my broader interest in ancient Judaism. So part of what drew me to the study of ancient Judaism was the fact not only that it gave me certain tools for studying familiar texts, because in part that's what it did. Ancient Judaism encompasses more than just the Judaism of the Second Temple period, Judaism of sort of the intertestamental period. It also encompasses later rabbinic literature. And so there was a whole set of texts with which I was already familiar, but part of what appealed to me was this opportunity to learn new material, to branch out intellectually. And part of that included the study of the New Testament, which I had never encountered during the course of my upbringing. And so, the opportunity to engage with the range of New Testament texts, I think, was something that was appealing. And I think that in the course of, my interest in the New Testament, I came to appreciate really, I think, two basic propositions. One is that the Jewish context of the New Testament means that our two faith traditions don't have to be as radically different, let's say, as we often suppose. And that once you begin to see the New Testament within its Jewish context, then it gives you a different perspective on how Judaism and Christianity really are interrelated. And that even if we sort of differ on a range of theological propositions, which of course Judaism and Christianity do, we share a common commitment to godliness, which is not something to take for granted at any historical moment, and certainly at this historical moment. So I think that was that was what I got from my initial interest in the New Testament. As far as why you said why is it that early Christianity? What was the question about early Christianity and ancient Judaism?
Well, so just basically the background on how they relate, like on a more academic level. Yeah.
Got it. So, so in general, the assumption is that Jesus himself was a Jew living toward the end of the Second Temple period. So the Second Temple is built in the year 515 BCE, ultimately destroyed in the year 70 CE. And Jesus, as described in the Gospels, is sort of an itinerant teacher, somebody who is sharing his wisdom, religious, ethical, moral, with various audiences. You can appreciate the profile of Jesus when you begin studying ancient Judaism more broadly. And so, for example, the Jewish historian Josephus, who is chronicling all of Jewish history, but particularly the final centuries of the Second Temple period, Josephus is writing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s CE. He mentions Jesus in the course of his writings in a passage that's hotly contested. The meaning of it and how much of it actually goes back to Josephus is hotly contested among scholars. But when you see the way that Josephus describes the first century of the Common Era, basically the period in which Jesus is traveling, especially through the Galilee, attracting a following, sharing his message, there are other people wandering through Judea and the Galilee at that time who resemble very closely Jesus and resonate with the message that he was trying to share. Basically, the idea of sort of a messianic outlook on Judaism was not unique to Jesus. It's something that you find attested in numerous places in Josephus's corpus, to the extent that Josephus, describing the destruction of the Second Temple, says that even as the flames were burning, the temple is basically on its last legs, you had thousands of Jews that gathered at the edge of the temple because they expected that the heavens were going to open and the Messiah was going to come. So it's to that extent that there was really a messianic consciousness about the Judaism, especially of the first century CE. And like I said, there were other people who were attracting followings, who were sharing their messianic messages. Sometimes they were countercultural, other times not. But the idea of kind of itinerant teachers who were attracting a following because of the message that they were projecting, and it was a message of a message of redemption, a message of peace, a message of reconciliation. Those kinds of messages were not unique to Jesus. And when you appreciate more what other Jews were saying at that time, you can appreciate kind of where was Jesus coming from, right? What was the world that produced somebody with Jesus's profile, and the message that Jesus was trying to project. So that's kind of how scholars, how historians will typically view the relationship between Jesus and Judaism. That is to say, to appreciate him as more typical than as strange in his time period, right? Not standing out, conventional in certain ways, unconventional in others for sure. Jesus isn't exactly like all these other itinerant teachers, but at the same time, more similar than we might otherwise suppose. And in general, for example, historians assume that Jesus continued to observe Jewish law, that the few passages in the Gospels that maybe suggest to the contrary might be kind of later projections of communities that had no longer continued to observe Jewish law, but that Jesus was presumably a Jew who was observing the Jewish law, but had a message that seemed to be more universalistic. The fact that he is, his message that focuses very much on sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes, that's not necessarily something that you would have seen a lot of Jews necessarily broadcasting, that message of not so much universalism, but of absolute forgiveness. That message of reconciliation, despite the fact that he wasn't necessarily speaking to the most highly observant, maybe that would have been what set Jesus apart. That's sort of the way in which historians view Jesus, and Paul, kind of against the background of both Jesus and of the Judaism of his day. Again, to the extent that Paul is a Jew, and the reason that from a historical perspective, it's hard to view Jesus as as like converting, as starting a new religion. In general, history doesn't really work that way. You don't have these sharp, sudden breaks with no with no preparation having been laid, right? That's not typically the way that history works. History typically works more gradually. And what Paul seems to be doing is Paul is building on what he describes as a revelation, an epiphany that he has witnessed. But that the way that increasingly, and again, it's not that all historians view Paul this way, but increasingly Paul comes to be understood as somebody who, like Jesus, is broadening the message of Judaism, taking it in new directions. Paul, maybe in more radical directions than Jesus himself, but nonetheless, understanding the Judaism of his day enables us to better appreciate who Paul is speaking to and what his message about the Judaism of his day was.
Thank you. Wow, that was a really good overview. I guess I'm a little curious more about Paul, and obviously we took a class with you, Paul, Profile of the First Century Jew. That was amazing. And so I guess what led you to teach that course, and do you think that course is like crossing boundaries, and how so?
That's an interesting question. The course was actually the third in a trilogy of courses that I had taught at Revel over the course of the last 3 years. So I was really interested in exploring some of the connections, not personal connections, between the three individual Jews about whom we have the most information from antiquity: Josephus, Philo, and Paul. Basically, all important writers during the first century of the Common Era, all writing in Greek, all writing principally from the diaspora. So Philo is probably a slightly older contemporary of Paul's. Philo's writing mostly in the 20s, 30s, even as late as the 40s CE. He's primarily based in Alexandria, but he's probably writing both in Alexandria and Rome, exclusively in Greek. Josephus would have been a younger contemporary of Paul. Paul's writings basically are he's writing his letters in the 50s and 60s CE. Josephus is born in the year 37 CE, so he's a younger contemporary of Paul, and he's doing his writing from Rome, again in Greek, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He was a priest from Judea who was taken with the Jews back to Rome, and he's writing a lot of history, biblical interpretation. And Paul is sort of situated chronologically between the two. So I was curious if what is it that diaspora Jews are thinking about? And is there some way in which studying the writings of three individuals, not just studying their writings, but what can we say about these three individuals as they emerge from these writings? Is there some way in which we can use them as prototypes for understanding what were the issues with which diaspora Jews were kind of preoccupied? So that was the idea was, so Josephus was what I taught 2 years ago, Philo was what I taught last year, and Paul is what I taught this year. It happened to be that it was just at the beginning of this productive relationship between YU and Philos, it's sort of fortuitous. Kind of one of the things that I think I discovered about some of these intersections between Josephus, Philo, and Paul. Josephus does refer to Philo a few times. He certainly had never met Philo. Philo probably would have been dead before Josephus had turned 10. And as I said, Josephus does refer to Jesus, but doesn't refer to Paul. But I think that what you find among all three of those writers writing in Greek from different areas within the Roman Empire is a certain emphasis on universalism. That's different in each of the cases. For Philo and Josephus are kind of writing from an apologetic perspective. They're trying to present a version of Judaism that would be appealing to a Gentile audience for different reasons, having to do with their particular historical contexts and the particular set of concerns that that they're trying to engage. For both of them, for Philo and Josephus, they're trying to kind of present a version of Judaism that will be compatible with Greco-Roman culture. So they're sort of trying to enlarge Greco-Roman culture so that it can encompass Judaism. Paul is kind of coming at it from kind of the opposite vantage point, which is to present a picture of Judaism that can be expanded to accommodate Gentiles. All three of them, though, are really situated within the diaspora, with Jewish-Gentile relations being, an everyday reality. They're all dealing with the same set of issues, which I thought was interesting. It wasn't supposed to be a course on New Testament or on early Christianity. That wasn't how it was conceived. Like I said, Paul's corpus is exactly the type of text that got me interested in ancient Judaism in the first place, because it is this kind of text that fills in a gap in my own knowledge. And again, being an academic, you always want to feel like you're learning new things, right? So that was kind of, so Paul's corpus always appealed to me for that reason. And from kind of a pedagogical perspective, again, my expectation was I would only be teaching this to Jewish students at YU. My aim was to show students that anyone interested in the study of ancient Judaism had to become acquainted with the writings of Paul. It's just basically an indispensable corpus, in part because once you begin to see him as Jewish, so what becomes interesting about Paul, like anyone else, but what's most interesting about Paul is not just how he resembles other Jews, but also how he differs. That gives us a broader sense of just how diverse the Judaism of his day was, Paul is not just like Josephus and like Philo and, and like Rabban Gamliel, and he's similar but also very different, and that's kind of what I think is especially fascinating and enriching about the study of Paul.
So I'm curious also about like the later interpretations of Paul. I mean, that's a huge burden in terms of Paul and Jewish-Christian relations. So maybe you could give like a overview of like Martin Luther and how the interpretation of Paul going forward to maybe the time of the Holocaust, and then how that changed then.
Yeah, sure. So Paul becomes a pivotal figure for Luther, writing in the 16th century, because Luther, the Protestant Reformation, was largely focused on a sense that Catholicism had become overly ritualized, had sort of abandoned the roots of Christianity. And so part of what Luther was trying to do is sort of to turn back the clock by ridding Christianity of the very hierarchical structure of the church, by ridding Christianity of what he describes as an excessive focus on ritual, as the particular believer's mediated relationship to God, right? The priest is mediating that relationship. So what Luther really latches onto in Paul is not just a foil for Catholicism, but also a foil for Judaism. Meaning, Luther comes in many ways to conflate Catholicism and Judaism. He identifies Paul as polemicizing against Jewish legalism, Jewish legalistic practice, by which Luther means kind of the obsession that Jews have with the very inconsequential and small details of practice, as if those are important to religion. Luther sees that in Paul as an extension of Luther's basic critique of Catholicism. So the way that Luther is reading Paul is really as an extension of the way that Luther himself is reading Catholicism. The way that later scholars talk about Luther is that Luther describes himself as having a tortured conscience. Again, he's somebody who felt like within Catholicism he didn't have the opportunity to achieve redemption. The idea of somehow coming close to God was foreclosed to him, and he sees much of that within Paul himself, and that what Paul is really arguing against in Judaism is the sense that the practice of Jewish law didn't afford him an opportunity to become close to God, didn't afford him an opportunity toward repentance, because it was basically a burden that he couldn't overcome. And so for various reasons, it seems like Luther turned to Paul as a model for his own religious sensibilities and for the problems that he saw in Catholicism. That really becomes the predominant way in which Protestants continued to read Paul for the next 400 years, and it really reinforces a certain supersessionist narrative. Namely, what Paul is arguing against was Jewish legalism, right? This sense of Jewish legalism that really gave rise to a deep sense of sin that that one couldn't escape from, because the law could only breed more and more sin. And so it was necessary for Jesus to come and save all of humanity from the burden of the law. And so in that way, what Luther is doing is he's really generating, supporting, reinforcing a supersessionist narrative. That supersessionist narrative comes to be associated, especially with German anti-Semitism in the 19th century. So one of the things that's interesting just about ancient Judaism, just to sort of circle back to what I was saying before, one of the things that's interesting is the study of ancient Judaism was actually known in 19th century Germany as late Judaism. The term ancient Judaism is not something that comes into fashion until the middle of the 20th century, German Protestants referred to it as late Judaism because for them, basically, Judaism dies with the coming of Jesus. And so Judaism is not, they don't see a distinction between sort of the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Judaism. They see a distinction, these German Protestant scholars, between the Judaism up until the time of Jesus, which is late and therefore dies, and then the new religion that Jesus has now been sent to found. And so that the historical scholarship that many of these German Protestants were producing was influenced by Luther's perception of Judaism and of Christianity as having superseded Judaism by virtue of sort of this Jewish legalistic practice, which, according to these historians, meant that Judaism had to die, right? It was inevitable because no one could ever be saved by Judaism. There was a sense in the aftermath of the Holocaust that this sort of consciousness was not the academic piece of it, right? It's sort of an interesting footnote that you had German philosophers, German theologians, even German students of Judaism who were all contributing, were affected by and contributing to the general sense of supersessionism. And there was a sense that perhaps Paul had, these readings of Paul in some way had contributed mightily to the anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust. And so, especially beginning in the 1950s, 1960s, there was an effort on the part of Christian scholars of the New Testament to go back to Paul and to see if there was a more sympathetic way to read Paul, a Paul that wouldn't generate anti-Semitism, but to the contrary, might actually promote rapprochement. And that was sort of the background to what came to be known more recently over the course of really the last 30 to 40 years as the new perspective on Paul. It's basically a perspective that viewed Paul very much as a Jew, whose main concern was not, he wasn't targeting Judaism. Paul, for this perspective, was actually trying to explain how it was that the God of the Jews could at the same time become God of the Gentiles. How could Gentiles make it into the Messianic community? Paul wasn't excluding Jews from the Messianic community. What he's trying to do is he's trying to explain how Gentiles actually can come into that Messianic community in the first place. Obviously, a very different reading of Paul, a reading of Paul that views him as a Jew with a very different set of beliefs, but nonetheless as a Jew whose whose Jewish background really animated his mission, animated the message that he was trying to promote. That sort of is the trajectory of perspectives on Paul going back, from Luther really to the present. Thumbnail sketch.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's really interesting, and I know we learned some of that in class too, but always appreciate the insight for sure. Within that, I guess we have a couple questions that I was curious about too. It's sort of kind of linked together, but maybe what's like one thing in your opinion that you'd like Christians to know about Paul, and then it can be the same thing or something else that maybe Jews should know about Paul that maybe they'd be surprised or maybe not know prior to this?
That's an interesting question. After our semester, I had an opportunity to debrief with everyone in the class. I think it was something like there were 7 or 8 Jews in the class, 7 or 8 Christians in the class. Mm-hmm. And, I think what I learned from speaking with the Christians in the class is that they had always sort of assumed the Lutheran reading of Paul, meaning that's the popular presentation of Paul in traditional Christianity and traditional Protestantism. And what I think would be important for Christians to know about Paul is the fact that Paul was a Jew, and that the supersessionist narrative is based on what is likely a misreading of Paul. That would kind of be one takeaway, I think, for Christians. Kind of related to that is the awareness that our interpretations of biblical texts, both the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, that they have there are ethical ramifications to our reading practices. We don't only interpret in a vacuum. Interpretations of our sacred texts always have real world ramifications, and that should really heighten our sensitivity to how it is that we read texts. To the extent that the traditional reading of Paul that bred supersessionism also had real world consequences for Christian-Jewish relations, that's something to keep in mind. Even if someone in the class preserved their prior reading of Paul, which is fine. It's nonetheless important to be aware of the assumptions that we make when we read our sacred texts and the ramifications of those assumptions. So those would kind of be some of the things that I would want a Christian to know about Paul. What I would want Jews to know about Paul. So I think here there are a few things. I think for those with interests in ancient Judaism, I think I would want them to know that Paul's writings can't be ignored, that they're an essential resource to the extent that we're viewing Paul as a Jew, both familiar and different, that his writings really are an essential resource. I would want them to understand that Paul was not the first convert to Christianity. There's often this notion that, Jesus was a Jew, but Paul was the first Christian. So I would want them to understand that Christianity developed more gradually and that the relationship between Judaism and Christianity historically is much more complex. And I think also there's a version of Paul's history. I don't know, let's say in our class, I don't know how many people in our class had heard this version of Paul, but one of the most popular works in Jewish literature over the course of the last millennium, 1,500 years, aside from the Talmud, is a work called Toldot Yeshu, a Hebrew work that basically translates roughly to the life of Jesus. And it's a work that was probably written in either Hebrew or Aramaic around the year 500 CE, has since been translated basically into every language that Jews speak, including, for example, including Yiddish. And the story that this is a very counter-historical presentation of both Jesus and Paul. The presentation of Paul in this text is one in which Paul actually was a double agent. Paul was actually one of the leaders of the Sanhedrin, and the Jews were being persecuted by the Christians at the time of Paul, and the rabbis on the Sanhedrin had to decide how exactly they were going to break ties with the Christians. They were causing problems for the Jews, and so they sent Paul undercover to mislead followers of Jesus into believing that God had told him that it was time to break free of Jewish law. And so Paul sort of takes one for the Jewish team, goes in as a double agent, convinces followers of Jesus that he had been sent by Jesus with this particular message. They had to stop keeping kosher. They had to stop keeping the Sabbath. They had to stop keeping Jewish festival practices. And that Paul really, therefore, is somebody who Jews should, whose legacy Jews should celebrate because, he really is kind of the one who's responsible for separating Christianity from Judaism. So I think that's a popular version of Paul's history that many Jews with no prior contact with Paul's corpus just naturally imagine to be true. And so I think it's very important for Jews to become acquainted with the historical Paul, to understand what Paul's actual message was. Both because it's always important, again, for us to jettison misconceptions. So misconceptions on the Christian side, misconceptions on the Jewish side, but also because I think that it's only when we understand our past that we can begin to move toward rapprochement. I think that, in terms of what I would want a Christian to understand about Paul, that, as opposed to what I would want a Jew to understand about Paul, to a certain extent, I would want both groups to understand that Paul was a Messianic Jew who believed in rapprochement for all of humanity. And I think one of the things that I felt most heartened about from the course that both of you took with me last semester was the sense of rapprochement between different faith traditions, studying this common text in a Jewish university, being taught by a Jewish professor, focused on the corpus of texts written by a Jew who became associated with Christianity, and the ways in which, if we study text and we focus not on, again, not on what separates us, but actually on what unites us, right? Commitment to godliness, commitment to the idea that God plays an important role in history, and in the course of humanity. There's a lot more that unites us than divides us. So that was, those would be, I think, some of the primary messages that I would hope that Jews and Christians would take away from the study of Paul.
It's a great answer. I think you're kind of pointing at two sides of like misconceptions on each side, right? So the side of Christianity is maybe see Luther, how he became, even what you spoke of earlier, he became very prominent in the viewpoint of a large contingency of basically all of Christianity, right? Which was damaging in a lot of ways. But then you see the other side, which I wasn't aware of before, is the writing you talked about within Judaism. It shows Paul as a very, very different double agent sort of person, but sort of meeting in the middle is very important, right? And I think Josh would agree with me too. Like that was, it's probably been our class with you was probably all of our favorites so far that were in the and I think for those reasons where we want to see that like-mindedness, and it's like, why do we have to focus so much on what's different about people and each other and really come together and see what's similar, right? And rejoice in that and celebrate each other no matter what. So I do appreciate your insight into that too, and just what each side can take away. Because I think even for me, being someone who grew up Christian, I wouldn't say I personally had like Luther's full beliefs growing up, but he was definitely a big part of our world and the Protestant movement. And so even for myself, like learned a lot of new things in a way in your course that I hadn't known before. So even for me as a Christian, knowing Paul before that was very enlightening as well. So
yeah, I think for me, the idea of E.P. Sanders, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, that really blew it out of the water for me, and especially the idea of like grace, and that's normally set in Christian circles and in like sermons. Grace is something that Judaism is not. It's like the opposite. So grace is seen as a foil of Judaism, kind of in the line of Luther. And E.P. Sanders showed that grace, if you want to call it that, was part of ancient Judaism. The idea that God had elected Jewish people to a covenant, and like that itself was an act of grace and mercy. Like they didn't earn it. In Christian terms, we talk about like earning salvation, earning grace. They didn't earn it. They already were granted it. And so that idea was really mind-blowing for me. And so I guess going forward, I'm kind of curious how like this field of Jewish Christian relations or New Testament studies, how that will inform your scholarship going forward, and I'll also a little bit more about your research trajectory.
So, I think that I had never taught a course like the one that we've been discussing before. I had taught, there have been Christians that have been in Revel, but on a very periodic and and really just like individual basis. We had never had classes with groups of Christians, and so I think it made me more sensitive to different audiences and the importance of bringing together Jews and Christians in the ways that we've talked about. So I think that I would welcome the opportunity to teach courses not only on Paul, but I think in some ways courses on Judaism that would include both Jews and Christians, again in ways that I think would accomplish a lot of the same goals, coming at it from sort of the set of Jewish texts. As far as how Paul kind of fits within my academic trajectory. So, I've written 2 books. The first of which was a revision of my dissertation that I did at NYU. And the second book, more recently, is a book on emotion in ancient Judaism. And they don't kind of at first glance have much to do with each other. They really both kind of circle around a set of common issues. The question that I'm kind of interested in, that I take up in both of those books, is how ancient Jews, so let's say in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE, the subsequent exile, creation of the diaspora, forced exile, right? You have a sprawling diaspora. Jews no longer enjoy political sovereignty. How Jews struggle to overcome a sense of powerlessness. Because for the first time, they're really not in control. And it's not obvious to Jews that God remains with them. Right? The idea that here you have this God who has destroyed his own temple, sent his own people into exile, was inconceivable to Jews. Inconceivable to you see that very clearly in some of the passages from Jeremiah, where Jeremiah in various places, Jeremiah 7, Jeremiah 26, Jeremiah 28, Jeremiah talks about the people of his day as refusing to believe him because they can't imagine that God would ever do this. Not because he's bound in a covenant with the Jews, but because gods in general would never destroy their own temple, would never exile their own people. And so the fact that that happens leads many to a sense of powerlessness, right? Divine absence. And so both of my books in different ways address the question of how Jews sought to overcome that sense of powerlessness, especially in the Second Temple period. So the first book that I wrote argues that, and when I don't think I did not set out, that wasn't like the overarching question that I sought to answer, but it turns out that was a question that I was interested in. The first book argues that they managed to overcome that sense of powerlessness. And again, I'm not talking about all Jews, but at least some Jewish compositions from that period, by kind of reconceiving their sense of time. So if Jews would have felt powerless, it would have been if they traced their origins back to the covenant at Sinai, because a covenant that's forged from within history means that there is a prehistory, and if there's a prehistory something, there can also be a post-history. And so the covenant, if forged within history, could also be dissolved within history. And to the extent that the covenant is dissolved within history, that's only going to reinforce the Jewish sense of powerlessness. How can they explain the diaspora, the destruction, loss of political sovereignty? God has obviously left them, and that's going to only breed a sense of powerlessness. So what you find among some Jewish works of the Second Temple period is a turn away from Sinai and back toward creation. That what you find is Jews tracing the origins of the covenant back toward creation, because what that manages to do is you lose the sense of sort of like prehistory, history, and therefore the possibility of post-history. There is no history. God sets out to elect the Jews at the time of creation. And if there have been various points during history when it seemed like God maybe had abandoned the Jews, that needs to be placed within the wider framework of creation. God's intention was always to eventually reconcile with the Jews. And you don't have to worry about sort of the problem of viewing time linearly. Right? If you start with Sinai, it means that time moves linearly from before to during to after. Any linear sense of time can be broken, right? And that sense of rupture was what would have scared the Jews. What they do by looking at creation as the beginning of Judaism is time is no longer linear. Time is rather cyclical. So it's going to start. It might end up sort of deviating along the way, but it's always going to come back to where it started. So that was kind of the subject of my dissertation. I expanded it in the context of this first book of mine. And then when I was in law school, the other thing that I encountered in law school was a lot of interdisciplinary study. So law in general, I gravitated more toward courses that were not like black letter law. So I wasn't so interested in like civil procedure and federal courts. I was much more interested in philosophy of law and sociology of law, anthropology of law. Those were all courses that I took in law school. And along the way, I became interested in the study of law and emotion, the ways in which our understanding of emotion in some way is affected by law, the way that law transforms our emotions, the way that our emotions can affect the law. And that became something that I really wanted to study after I completed my dissertation, which was in 2011. So my second book tries to understand how Jewish authors sought to convince their audiences. Again, same time period, Second Temple period, Jews are living through kind of very bleak conditions, sense of powerlessness is probably rampant. How Jewish authors at that time sought to convince their audiences that the Jewish identity was defined by a specific set of emotions which set them apart from the wider Greco-Roman world. And it was because those emotions aligned them with God that those emotions were ultimately a source of power. And so here you have to understand, I was working with a model of emotion that comes out of like philosophy of emotion and sociology of emotion that looks at emotions not as uncontrollable impulses, but rather as cognitive frameworks. So if you think about grief, so grief is not just something that we instinctively feel when something bad happens. Grief is something that we feel when we feel like something has happened that is irreparable and that we don't have control to reverse, right? That's sort of like the cognitive framework for grief. Cognitive framework for disgust is a sense of superiority, of otherness. Someone disgusts me or something disgusts me if I feel like they are subordinate to me. Disgust, therefore, is typically not something that you'll have from a subordinate person or subordinate group toward someone else. Usually it will be it's a hierarchical emotion. So every emotion sort of has certain cognitive framework. And that was sort of the model that I was using in studying emotion in the Second Temple period among these different writers. The emotions that you find expressed in these texts are not what we would consider classically powerful. So emotions like grief and pain and compassion were all regarded in antiquity as effeminate emotions. They're explicitly gendered, but Jewish authors claimed that what would have been regarded as powerless emotions in the wider world actually aligned them with a different form of power, namely with divine power. So if they weren't supposed to become angry, but rather were supposed to respond with compassion, it's because anger and violence was reserved for God, right? But people are not supposed to respond with anger. People are only supposed to respond with compassion. That's kind of that would be kind of one example. And if you respond appropriately, what that means is you are aligning yourself with God. The more that we align ourselves with God, the more that we are able to recapture agency and overcome our sense of powerlessness. That was sort of the framework for the book, and it assumes not just that emotions are also cognitive elements of experience, but that they're also deeply bound up in power. Because if you think about all of our interactions have a certain dimension of power to them. And all of our interactions also provoke emotion, right? Every one of our interactions in some way plays upon both power relations and also emotions. And so to that extent, every power relationship also is suffused with some sort of emotional content. And so that was sort of the intersection between emotion and power was also part of that whole kind of like network of ideas. And I think Paul for me was very interesting because you do find, and Paul is, there's emotion, in every chapter of Paul. And so, so part of it, just in terms of my research trajectory, I was, for example, interested in the emotion of grief in 2 Corinthians. I was also interested in Romans, to the extent that what Paul is trying to do is to convince his audience that they are not supposed to be observing the Jewish law. How is he capitalizing on their emotions in order to do that? like, because it's not just about Paul describing his own emotions, which is largely what he does in passages in 2 Corinthians where he talks about grief and pain, but it's also how does he try to manipulate the emotions of his audience so that they come around to his point of view. So that was also kind of something that interests me, especially in Romans, but more generally, a lot of the emotions that Paul directs toward Jews, at least the emotions that he expresses in his writings about Jews, was also something that did and continues to interest me. So that's kind of like how I see Paul fitting within my research trajectory. So
It's fascinating.
Well, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see how you adapted like academic kind of modern frameworks and applying it to ancient Judaism, and that's really cool that you can do that. Thomas, do you have anything to say?
No, I think as far as this goes, I think it's been awesome. I don't have any other questions. If you have any questions for us, I guess before we end this.
Yeah, I mean, I would just love to hear, how your experience at YU has shaped your understanding of Jewish-Christian relations. How's it impacted the two of you? I'd love to hear. I think probably your audience would love to hear it. I certainly would love to hear it as somebody who kind of undertook that journey with the two of you guys.
Sure, I'll go first if that's all right, Josh. So I think for me coming into it, so I've had an interest for a long time in Jewish-Christian relations. Where I'm from in Omaha, I don't have like a broad view of it, or like I'm not really well connected within the Jewish community here, and that's okay. And so I was very excited when I became part of this, was able to become part of this program, and just really kind of, in some points, probably a little intimidated, wondering how a small group of people would be welcomed. And I didn't have any doubts from the interactions. You know what I mean? Maybe it's more internal, but I think for me it's been really exciting. It's really, I'm hoping once I'm done with the master's program to be involved in some way in that world, and I would like to maybe see. My hope is to see it even be bigger, and like kind of in what you were saying, how there's these general similarities between the two religions anyway, and it does feel like it's been like growing up. It felt very segregated to me. I was like, this is a whole different thing. And even for myself growing up, Catholicism was even very different to me. There's the three, those three sides in my mind. It's Christianity, Catholicism, and Judaism, and they're all very distinct, are in their own ways. Coming to find out, some of that's true, but also they're very similar. And so for me, it's given me, I've become excited and hopeful that we can continue some sort of dialogue, or I can get plugged into, whether it's with YU or making connections to there, or in my own city because I've tried and I've working at it, and there's just a lot of variables to it. I think in the Midwest as well, it's a little different, I think, and so, and one of the other things that's been really neat is just maybe sharing with people who normally wouldn't really be interested because they know I'm in a master's program, and being able to really explain like, hey, not only am I getting a master's from a Jewish university, and really beyond that, for me personally, where I grew up and came from, somebody getting a college degree, let alone a master's, was pretty unheard of. And so, and the personal side of it's like very proud of that and humbled and grateful. But for it to be in a very specific niche side of academia, a lot of people are like, well, what do you mean? Like, that's kind of like, it doesn't, a lot of people say, oh, are you getting your MBA? And I'm like, no, I'm getting a master's in Jewish studies, basically Hebraic studies. And so it's always, of course, the question after is why or how. And so and then I always get really excited about it when I talk about it. And so and I think just the level of acceptance that we've been given from Yeshiva from top to bottom, to me, has been very heartwarming. And I didn't think we were going to be rejected in any matter, but like, I just wasn't sure how it was going to go. And so, um, on my side of it, that's, to me, it's been like such an awesome experience. And uh, like I said, I hope to continue in some way in that world. And I don't know how that looks in my future, but I'm sure just, I'm like, it just makes sense to me to be involved in that. And so um, whether it's academic or a religious side of it, I don't know yet, or even just something like this where it's just a continual progression of dialogue with other people, whether it's from yeshiva or secular or religious or Israel or America or I don't, whatever comes along, I'm open to it. So, yeah, so I appreciate the question. And that's for me, I guess, really the possibilities of what I can do in the world I can be in is opened up, because I think maybe what I'm trying to really get at is I've always wanted to be in this world. I just didn't know how to get there.
Hmm.
And maybe being in this program is a little more focused, and maybe you know what I mean? Um, I'm being guided to something that I didn't have prior. And so um, that's kind of where I'm at with it. So it's exciting. I think it's given me some confidence to be able to communicate a little better and not feel so overwhelmed with it all, maybe, and that it's so different. It's like, no, we're all the same. Like, we're all just people, and the beliefs might be different on some level, but also that's okay. And so, so I'm hoping to continue in some capacity. So I don't know. We'll see where it goes.
That's great. That's great, Tommy. I mean, like, as a faculty member, we couldn't ask, one of the things that I really enjoyed about this class is I love academia, I love teaching, but you never feel like your work really matters. I mean, does it really, does it really matter if, I don't know, if some obscure text said whatever, one thing or the other thing? But one thing that I felt like came out of this class was I felt like there were real world consequences, kind of like what I was saying before about there being certain ethical ramifications to how we read. I felt like there were real world consequences to this class. Like we had real impact on real people and how they think about their relations with others. And that for me was unique. And the fact that you're able to take that away from the masters that you're doing with us is just like totally heartwarming for me. So
that's awesome. I love it, as it should be.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, this program has been amazing from the beginning. I've been really blown away by the adoption, and the embracing we've received, especially I don't know about you, Tommy, but I've been able to develop some relationships. I know we're distant, but I've been able to develop some relationships like online and like chatting and emailing. So that's really, and just to see that people are so friendly towards us Christians. I was a little bit apprehensive, but that's been really great. And yeah, and just my background, I've always, maybe not always, but for a long time, I've been interested in Hebrew, Israel, Judaism when I first started studying Hebrew. And our first podcast episode, I kind of talk about that, the background a little bit, but that's been with me for a while. And so this is kind of just the culmination of it. And I'm hoping to do a PhD. I mean, I applied to the PhD program at YU.
No way.
Oh, wow.
So
I
don't know if the committee has met or
I'm
what
not on
they've
the
decided
committee.
Put a good word in, I guess. Huh?
I'll put a good word in, absolutely.
But I'm sort of interested in studying not only Protestant Jewish relation, like how Protestants and Jews have interacted from the 1500s and 1600s onward, but also kind of how the earlier classical texts from ancient Judaism influenced their thought and how those texts were rediscovered. So both kind of the current version or iteration of that relationship is of interest to me, but also, like you said, the ramifications and the ancient underpinnings of those texts from the 2nd century are really interesting to me.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's important to have both I think that the deeper knowledge that we have of these texts, the more informed we are when we think about kind of the contemporary world. So to the extent that you only plan to study them more deeply and in greater detail, I think that that's, that will only enhance your appreciation for everything that we've been talking about. So that's great. I have the fondest feelings for both of you guys. I appreciate I appreciate the opportunity to talk, to follow up a little bit. And thank you guys both so much for this opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was awesome.
Okay.
And yeah. I guess I'll put a link I guess to some of your books, and I'll put a link to whoever's watching in terms of applying to the YU Philos master's program, the 1-year program.
That'd be great.
I think there's a new cohort coming in, so yeah.
Great.
Thank you for your time.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Take care, guys. Good talking.
All right. Thank you.